She stood in the torch-lit hallway of the royal palace, her shadow trembling on the marble like a trapped spirit. Behind the sealed doors, the old king, her own father, was dying, calling her name with a voice that scraped like broken glass. Courtiers whispered that with his last breath, he would decide whether she would rule Egypt or burn with him. And yet the darkest secret of the Ptolemaic dynasty was not that they killed one another. It was what they created together.
The story of the Ptolemaic dynasty begins not with Alexandria's shimmering marble, nor with the gold-laced crowns worn by its sovereigns, but with a curse, one woven from paranoia, ambition, and the desperate pursuit of divine blood. It was a dynasty founded by Ptolemy I Soter, Alexander the Great's most cunning general, who crafted a kingdom that pretended to be Greek, yet throbbed with the ancient heart of Egypt. But to rule Egypt meant more than holding a throne. It meant becoming a god. So the Ptolemies adopted a ritual older than the pyramids themselves, the belief that royal blood must never dilute. Brothers married sisters, fathers declared daughters their queens. Children were born into palaces where every face reflected the same sharply carved cheekbones, the same cold, pale eyes, the same inherited madness. And among these children rose one girl whose story would eclipse even the horrors whispered about her ancestors. Her name was Arsinoë, daughter of a king groomed to love no one, and granddaughter of a queen who strangled her own siblings to silence dissent. Arsinoë grew up inside chambers where the air always smelled faintly of incense and fear. Eunuchs taught her languages, priests taught her rituals. Her father taught her power, the kind that pulsed beneath the surface of every royal feast, every procession, every whispered threat. And from the moment she could speak, she learned that loyalty to the dynasty meant obedience to him. He praised her beauty, her intelligence, her poise. He held her close during court ceremonies, seating her beside him like a living emblem of divine legitimacy. When foreign ambassadors bowed, they bowed to her as well, as though the kingdom itself had already chosen her future. But inside the palace's labyrinth of columns and shadow, the servants whispered that the king's affection was not merely paternal, that in the line of the Ptolemies, a daughter could become more than a daughter, that she could become the most dangerous woman in Egypt. Arsinoë sensed it long before she understood it. She saw the way courtiers froze when the king placed a hand on her shoulder. She overheard the quivering voices of officials who argued behind closed doors, insisting that the king must choose a queen from outside his blood, but never daring to say why. And she heard the queen, her stepmother, crying softly in the night, her voice echoing like a ghost down the cool stone hallways of the palace. By the time Arsinoë turned 12, the Nile had flooded twice with omens. Birds fell dead from the sky, a plague destroyed entire harvests in the delta, and a comet streaked across the heavens, its tail burning like an accusation. Egyptian priests spoke of divine warnings. Greek philosophers dismissed the signs as coincidence, but the king believed none of them. He believed only in his lineage. Thus he summoned Arsinoë to the Hall of Ancestors, a vast chamber filled with statues of Ptolemies long dead, their eyes carved with an almost human cruelty. Torches flickered along the polished walls, making the stone faces seem alive. The king stood before her in ceremonial armor, gold gleaming against his aging skin. "You are the purity of my bloodline," he told her. She felt her stomach twist, unsure whether the words were blessing or threat. "You will preserve what others seek to contaminate." Arsinoë stared at the statues behind him. Their stony gazes, unblinking and pitiless, made her skin crawl. She sensed she was being drawn into something inescapable, something sacred, monstrous, and ancient. And then he placed a crown on her head. Not a crown of a princess, but of a queen. Servants gasped, priests fell to their knees, even the guards stiffened in fear. Arsinoë knew in that moment that the world outside the palace would never see her the same way again. But inside the palace, inside, everything was about to become much, much worse. Arsinoë was too young to understand the magnitude of her coronation, but not too young to feel its weight. The palace changed overnight. Servants who had once smiled now avoided her eyes. Advisors who used to bow with ease now bowed with trembling hesitation, unsure whether they were addressing a child or a future tyrant. Her stepmother vanished from public life entirely, slipping into the shadows of the women's quarters like a ghost stripped of purpose. The king, however, seemed invigorated, as if crowning his daughter had reversed the decay of age. He walked taller, his voice grew louder. He demanded more ceremonies, more festivals, more opportunities to present Arsinoë to the people. In the great courtyards of Alexandria, crowds roared as she stood beside him, draped in gold and hyacinth blue linen, her small hands clutching a scepter she could barely lift. To the people, she was divine. To the palace, she was untouchable. To her father, she was everything. But even as the king's obsession deepened, the kingdom itself began to splinter. Ptolemaic relatives, each one more ambitious than the last, circled the throne like vultures. Her uncles plotted, her aunts schemed, cousins whispered in secret rooms. Claimants emerged from Cyprus, from Phoenicia, from distant Greek estates, all insisting they possessed the truest bloodline, the purest right to rule. And the king, terrified of dilution, tightened his grip on his daughter. He assigned her personal tutors not to educate her, but to shape her. The philosophers who taught her rhetoric did so with trembling hands. The mathematicians who explained geometry looked at her as one might look at a priestess destined for a sacred but terrible purpose. And the royal physicians who monitored her health whispered among themselves, frightened by the fragility of her bones, the pallor of her skin, the tremor in her fingers, signs of inbreeding so well known in the dynasty that even slaves recognized them. Still, the king saw only perfection. When she turned 13, he began summoning her to private dinners. The first evening, she wore a flowing gown of white silk that dragged behind her like spilled moonlight. The scent of lotus candles thickened the air until breathing felt like swallowing perfume. A troupe of musicians played soft melodies, their eyes fixed on the floor, never daring to look up. The king spoke to her of destiny, of divine ancestry, of the sacred marriages of the gods. Arsinoë, though frightened, answered with the rehearsed grace of a queen. She listened as he described how Zeus married Hera, how Osiris united with Isis, how divinity required purity. His voice drifted like smoke, filling the silent hall, echoing against the vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. He said, "You are my blood, my mirror, my other half." She felt a coldness seep into her bones. But the real horror came not from her father's words, but from the faces of the servants standing along the walls. They did not react. They did not flinch. They had expected this. They had seen it before. In that moment, Arsinoë understood. This was not her father alone. This was the dynasty. Night after night, the dinners continued, each one more elaborate, more private, more suffocating. The king's hand lingered too long on hers. His gaze softened in ways that made her recoil. He dismissed the musicians, the servants, the guards, until the palace itself seemed to hold its breath, listening, waiting. And yet the court remained silent. Not one advisor spoke, not one priest intervened, not one relative dared step between them. Because if Arsinoë refused her father, another daughter would take her place. And if the king died without a divine heir, a civil war would consume Egypt. She was no longer a girl. She was a weapon, a wound the dynasty intended to wield. The pressure grew unbearable. And then something unexpected happened. A boy arrived at court, a young soldier, scarcely older than 16, the son of a minor nobleman from Memphis. His name was Theodorus. He had dark hair, sharp eyes, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was assigned to serve as one of Arsinoë's palace guards, a position viewed as symbolic, even insulting for so young an officer. But to Arsinoë, he was the first person in years who looked at her not with fear, but with recognition. The first who spoke to her not as a goddess or a possession, but as someone trapped and yearning. He noticed the way she hesitated before entering private dinners. He noticed the tremor in her voice when the king's attendants summoned her. He noticed the sorrow in her eyes during ceremonies when she smiled for crowds who mistook gilded suffering for divinity. And Arsinoë noticed him. For the first time, she felt the stirrings of something dangerously human, hope. But in the Ptolemaic court, hope was a death sentence. The king saw her glancing at Theodorus during processions. He saw the guard's hand linger a moment too long when helping her down from a chariot. He saw the flush in her cheeks when the boy addressed her with soft-spoken respect. The king saw everything. And one evening, as a crimson sunset bled across the horizon, he summoned 3 of his most loyal eunuchs. His command was simple, unquestionable, irrevocable. Arsinoë would be queen, and queens had no need for distractions. Theodorus was to disappear.
Theodorus vanished without ceremony. No announcement was made, no charges read, no body displayed. One morning his post stood empty, his spear resting against the wall where he had left it the night before. By noon, his name had already been erased from the guard lists. By dusk, it was as if he had never existed at all. Arsinoë understood the message immediately. The palace had spoken in its oldest language, silence. The king did not mention the boy. He did not need to. Instead, he increased the number of rituals, surrounding his daughter with priests, astrologers, and philosophers who spoke endlessly of fate and divine order. He ordered new coins minted, bearing both their profiles side by side, their faces nearly identical in stylized perfection. Across Egypt, the image spread. Father and daughter fused into a single symbol of rule. The people whispered, but they also bowed. That year, the Nile failed to rise to its proper height. Crops withered, grain prices soared. Riots broke out in the lower quarters of Alexandria. The king blamed impiety, foreign influence, and disloyal blood. He doubled down on the idea that only absolute purity could save the kingdom from collapse. And so, the unthinkable was formalized. A marriage was announced, not to a foreign prince, not to a Macedonian cousin, but within the royal household itself. The decree was written in careful language, cloaked in theology and tradition. The priests declared it a sacred union, mirroring the gods. The court herald spoke of stability, continuity, and divine favor. Arsinoë shed nothing. Her consent was never requested. The ceremony took place at dawn, within the innermost sanctuary of the palace complex. No crowds were permitted, no cheers echoed through the streets. Only the muffled chants of priests and the hiss of incense filled the air. The walls were painted with scenes of gods embracing gods, their expressions eternally serene. Arsinoë stood motionless, crowned and robed,
her face a mask carved by discipline and fear. The king, adorned in gold and ceremonial armor, appeared almost triumphant, as though he had conquered not just a kingdom, but time itself. From that day forward, Arsinoë ceased to be presented as merely the king's daughter. She was proclaimed his co-ruler, his divine counterpart. The palace adjusted swiftly. New protocols were issued, new titles invented. Servants were instructed never to refer to her familial role aloud. Any slip of the tongue was punished harshly. Reality itself was reshaped by decree. But bodies do not obey decrees as easily as words. Within months, whispers returned, this time darker, heavier, and impossible to suppress. Royal physicians were summoned at odd hours. Eunuchs guarded hallways with heightened vigilance. Priests performed purification rites behind sealed doors. Arsinoë withdrew from public life. She stopped attending festivals. She ceased appearing on balconies. Her chambers became a place of constant supervision, monitored by women loyal only to the king. Even her tutors were dismissed, deemed unnecessary. The kingdom waited. When the announcement finally came, it was delivered with practiced solemnity. A child would be born, an heir blessed by the gods themselves. Proof, the king declared, that the divine bloodline remained unbroken. The court erupted, not with joy, but with fear. Some advisors fled Alexandria that very night, claiming sudden illnesses or urgent missions abroad. Others swore renewed oaths of loyalty, their voices shaking as they kissed the floor before the throne. The priests proclaimed miracles, the philosophers fell silent. Beyond the palace walls, the people reacted with confusion and dread. Some celebrated, believing the gods had intervened. Others crossed themselves and whispered of curses older than the city itself. In taverns and marketplaces, rumors spiraled into legends before the child was even born. Inside her chambers, Arsinoë stared at the painted ceiling for hours at a time, watching gods frozen in eternal embrace. She felt less like a queen and more like a vessel, hollowed out by forces too vast and ancient to fight. She knew one truth with terrifying clarity. If the child lived, the dynasty would claim victory. If the child died, the blame would fall upon her. And if the king died before the birth, Egypt would burn. The king, meanwhile, grew increasingly erratic. Age finally caught him, gnawing at his strength, clouding his judgment. He lashed out at advisors, accused relatives of treason, ordered executions based on dreams and omens. He slept little, haunted by visions of rivals tearing down his statues and erasing his name. He clung to Arsinoë's condition as proof that the gods still favored him. As winter approached, his health deteriorated rapidly. Fever gripped him. His hands trembled uncontrollably. Physicians whispered of poison, though no one dared say it aloud. Every faction in the court waited, calculating, preparing. Arsinoë felt the walls closing in. She was carrying not just a child, but the fate of an empire already rotting from within. And when the king finally collapsed during a council meeting, blood staining his ceremonial robes, the palace descended into chaos. Because the question was no longer whether the dynasty would survive. The question was who would survive it.
The king died before dawn. No trumpet announced it. No proclamation echoed through Alexandria. His death arrived quietly, like rot finally giving way beneath a collapsing pillar. When the physicians emerged from his chambers with lowered eyes and blood-stained sleeves, the palace already knew. The corridors filled with whispers, hurried footsteps, and the soft hiss of drawn blades. Within hours, the court fractured. Factions formed instantly, some loyal to the unborn heir, others eager to erase the final stain of the dynasty by any means necessary. Priests argued theology, generals argued succession, courtiers argued survival. And in the center of it all sat Arsinoë, alone in her chambers, listening to the palace tear itself apart. She was proclaimed sole ruler before sunset. The decree was rushed, sloppily inscribed, sealed in panic rather than ceremony.
The throne room stood half-empty during her coronation. Many who should have been present were already fleeing Egypt or barricading themselves behind guards and bribes. Arsinoë ascended the throne draped in black and gold, her face calm, her eyes hollow. She ruled in name, but power had moved elsewhere. The child was born during a violent storm that lashed Alexandria with rain and thunder. The midwives later whispered that the sky itself seemed to recoil. When the infant's cry finally pierced the chamber, no one smiled. The priests declared it an omen. The physicians exchanged uneasy glances. The women attending Arsinoë avoided her eyes. The heir lived, but the dynasty was already dead. Rumors spread faster than decrees ever could. Foreign powers mocked Egypt openly. Greek philosophers wrote scathing treatises condemning the Ptolemaic court as a grotesque parody of divine kingship. Egyptian priests quietly withdrew their support, performing rituals without invoking the queen's name. Arsinoë tried to rule. She issued reforms, stabilized grain prices, reopened trade routes. For a brief moment, it seemed the kingdom might endure. But the stain of the dynasty could not be washed away by policy. Every order she gave was met with resistance. Every decision sparked rebellion. The army fractured, the treasury emptied. Assassination attempts became routine. One night, as Arsinoë stood alone on a balcony overlooking the harbor, she realized the truth that generations before her had refused to accept. The gods had never demanded purity. Men had, and they had destroyed everything in its name. The child, her child, was smuggled out of the palace under cover of darkness, sent to a distant province with loyal guards and a new identity. Official records would later claim the heir died in infancy. The truth vanished into silence, just like so many others before it. As for Arsinoë, her end came not with spectacle, but with erasure. Her name was struck from inscriptions, her statues were defaced, coins bearing her image were melted down. Later chroniclers would argue over her fate, poison, exile, execution, but no records survived to confirm it. The dynasty moved on, pretending the episode had never happened. But history remembered. Centuries later, scholars would look back on the Ptolemaic dynasty not as rulers touched by divinity, but as a warning. A family so obsessed with preserving power that it consumed itself from the inside. A lineage that mistook blood for legitimacy, control for destiny, and silence for stability. Arsinoë's story became a shadow beneath the marble grandeur of Alexandria. A reminder that the greatest horrors of history are rarely committed in chaos. They are committed in palaces, sanctified by tradition and justified by power.